Hello, John Whatley with Stein Whatley Astorino, here today with my partner Rob Astorino, and you're listening to the SWA podcast. Today we're going to talk about impaired driving and how that might impact your civil case. Primarily, this is impaired driving season. The National National Highway Transportation Safety Administration has a awareness campaign that runs between December, I believe, 15th and January 1st. And the whole idea of the campaign is to build awareness about drunk driving. They also work with local police agencies around Indiana and Kentucky and nationally. Checkpoints, all these types of things are part of this awareness campaign that they do with local law enforcement. So we want to talk about that now. It seems like it's the opportune time to talk about just to help, one, build awareness, but two, if any viewers have questions about if they were hit by a drunk driver, how that might impact their case, the benefits and cons of having a parallel criminal case that the state might be bringing against that driver in addition to the civil claim. So, Rob, have you had these cases in the past? And throw your 2 cents in.
Yeah, I have dealt with these in the past and present. And, just before we really even get started, like John said, New Year's Eve is one of the biggest party nights of the year, and that does lead to people, being away from their home and drinking. Luckily, the options for dealing with that have come so far. There's rideshare companies. There's a growing number of people who are, choosing not to drink even if they are in places where other people are. You should always have a reasonable option to get home safely from where you are. And the number one thing that we want you to take away from this is, whether it's New Year's Eve or any other night, just please, make that safe decision, protect others, but also protect yourself. And that's another big thing that we're going to be talking about tonight. So yeah, that's the number one thing that I can tell everybody with regards to this is just, be safe out there, make the smart decision, have a plan ahead of time, because, the more you go into the night with a plan of how you're already going to deal with getting home, the, less you'll be stuck in an uncomfortable situation and have to deal with things on the fly and potentially have to take that risky decision that you don't want to.
Yeah. And it's not something you should take lightly either. It's definitely something you should think about. In Kentucky, 17% of all highway fatalities are related to impaired driving. In Indiana, it is actually 29%, according to a study that the Indiana Department of Transportation did. Alcohol impairment contributed 29% of Indiana fatalities in 2022. Those are big numbers. 3 out of all 4 car wrecks that occur tend to be males between the ages of 20 and 25. Of impaired drivers, it's roughly about the same. It's men tend to be slightly higher. It's 5% of all fatality. 5% of all fatalities include a male driver, 4% female driver. And the most, the most dangerous time to be on the road is between 12 and 4 a.m. As far as if you're looking at the clock and what time these occur, clearly it can happen at 3:30 in the afternoon. But in general, there's a cluster around 12 to 4 a.m. So when it comes to New Year's, that's when people are out after midnight. So it's really important. One, you're going to have people in that certain demographic between the 20 and 25 year age group. They're going to be out during the time in which most of these things occur. So if you can make sure that you have a driver that is a sober driver, or if you just want to avoid that evening altogether, it's a way to be safe on the road.
Yeah, unfortunately there are thousands of impaired driving wrecks every year, and they do come with increased consequences both for the impaired drivers themselves and for the people that experience these wrecks. People who get hit are often hurt worse. Fatalities increase in these because there's risky behavior associated with them. And normally if you're involved in a motor vehicle wreck and it's your fault, you may have insurance consequences, you may have some civil liability consequences, but other than that, you can pretty much go on with your life. If you cause a wreck and you're impaired, that is going to drastically impact your life in a negative way. There's some other attorneys that we respect. They're running an ad campaign right now that says, it's not really saying anything about their firms, just saying be safe on New Year's. We echo that message. And can't stress enough that it's important to make those smart choices and avoid this altogether, so you don't become a statistic like the ones that we're talking about here.
Yeah. So both Kentucky and Indiana, clearly, I'm sure the viewers know, we have laws against drunk driving. Both states, it's 0.08 or higher, and that's considered per se. And per se, by legal standards, means that the only thing they have to prove is, one, that you're operating a vehicle, and two, you had a BAC over 0.08. And that's all they have to prove in order to prove that you were operating a vehicle while intoxicated. Now, Kentucky also, additionally, in addition to the DUI statutes, it has a vehicular manslaughter statute right on point that just essentially says that if you are operating a motor vehicle, that you're per se intoxicated and you cause the death of another individual, you can be charged. And it's a felony. It's a Class B felony in the state of Kentucky. Indiana does not have a law directly on point on that, but they do have a reckless homicide, and they kind of bootstrap the fact that you are driving intoxicated as a reckless.
Yeah, don't think you're going to get away with it in Indiana.
No, and this is not about getting away with it or not, but from our standpoint, we're really worried about the victims of any sort of crime like that. And what comes up in these cases, we've got either a client who's dead, so we're representing the estate for a family that's lost and it's grieving a loved one, or these cases create really severe injuries. So we have someone that's maybe either disabled as a result of it. We've had that in the past. In fact, in Indiana, a gentleman that was really hurt, had to be flown out to U of L hospital from the scene because of the seriousness of his injuries. And that young lady was intoxicated and been out drinking at various bars. Now, it creates problems for our case because there's in Kentucky and Indiana, we have two systems. We got the civil system. We also have the criminal system. We have no real impact on the criminal side, but the criminal side and how that is developing can have impacts on our civil case. Can you talk about some of the benefits of having a criminal case that's kind of parallel to ours that's running, and maybe some of the drawbacks?
Yeah, sure. And the first thing I would say just about all this stuff is if you are a victim of being hit by a drunk driver, or you think you're a victim of being hit by a drunk driver, sometimes not always obvious at the scene. It is really important to get an attorney involved early, even more so than in a regular case, which, we've also said at various times that's a very important thing for you to do. But in a DUI situation, especially if you've been hit by an impaired driver or drunk driver, you really need an attorney because there's going to be a lot of different things that could potentially happen. There, may or may not be criminal charges against this driver. And if there are, you are going to be asked to participate in that criminal case, even if it's in the form of making a victim impact statement or, potentially testifying as a witness as to what you saw or experienced at the scene. And those are things that the criminal case often, not always, but often moves faster than a civil case because they don't have to wait for you to fully recover for your injuries most times to proceed with it. So they're going to ask you to put things down on paper or make statements about what happened. And those things, while you're not even thinking about the civil case at that point, you're worried about getting justice against the person who hit you, those things can potentially be used against you later. So it's important to sit down, make sure that your victim impact statement takes into account all of your injuries, lets them know, what medical treatment you've been getting. The criminal case may potentially want to get you what's called restitution, which is payment from the defendant directly. However, if you do that, it could potentially affect your civil payouts later if you agree to certain things. So it's very important that while that criminal case is working, prosecutors and victim advocates will often try to make it seem like, it's your case against that other driver, but it's not. It's the state's case. The state is the client in the criminal case, and you have very little to no control over how that prosecutor handles it. I've had victims of DUIs where the prosecutors ran into a well-funded DUI defense lawyer. There were problems with the way the police officer conducted the stop, and so the prosecutors dropped the case. And it was a very good, DUI case. There was a lot of evidence to suggest that, and, my clients were left out in the cold. We had to come up with other solutions for them because we didn't have, a prosecutor who frankly was interested in achieving justice for these people.
Right.
And there's very little that we can do about that in the criminal side of things. Now, the other side of that is that if you do have an engaged prosecutor, if you have an easy DUI case that they're looking to put away, and they can get a plea deal or conviction on the DUI, then that's something we can take into the civil case and, leverage it to your advantage. If you are hit by a drunk or impaired driver and, all other things being equal, your civil case will have increased value. There's no easy way to say that. It may not seem fair to you at various things because, the entire point of the justice system and the tort setting is to, restore people who are injured. But same injuries, same loss, same impact, same everything. If one of them has a drunk driver who's responsible and one of them doesn't, the case that has the drunk driver is going to have a higher case value.
Yeah.
Period.
I'm going to clarify that a little bit because I don't want the viewer to think just because there's a higher case value that it does not also create problems. Because, one thing I always hear is like, oh, this is a slam dunk. That guy was drunk or this woman was drunk.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why it's taking so long to have this, it's taking so long to get this resolved. Well, one of the things that happen, there's a constitutional element that exists in criminal cases that can affect civil cases, and that's your Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. So during the pendency of a criminal case, oftentimes our ability to depose the other party or get certain discovery responses from the defendant is basically paused during the criminal action. Because they are pleading the fifth on a lot of things. So that could be problematic. That can slow down the civil case. The benefit of that is, so oftentimes in the criminal case, as part of a plea, if they ever reach a plea in that particular case, is that the defendant will make a admission on the record that, yeah, I agree that this occurred, whatever. And that can help our case on the civil side as far as any sort of admission is concerned. But you may have to wait out a year or 2 years as the process. Now, a well-funded defendant, and in the case we had up in Indiana, One of the things that they did is they kept pushing out dates for resolution of this case. That could be for a lot of reasons, and in some cases it could be that they're hoping to push this out beyond the statute date that you don't file. Now, that would never happen in our case. Clearly, we go ahead and file and take care of that. But if you are a defendant that doesn't have an attorney, you talked about get the attorney involved early, okay? One, because attorneys, if you come to an attorney that knows what they're doing, they're going to meet all of your procedural deadlines, statutory deadlines, make sure things are filed properly. But two, they can also help you shepherd you through the criminal side. So in that particular case, I would go up with the client on the defendant's court dates, make sure we were there, we were following along, we talked to the prosecutor, I made sure that the prosecutor knew who my client was. Now, we can't tell the prosecutor how to run their case, but if we were there and we're supportive and we were providing them with information, it's more likely that we're going to get some sort of resolution that is good for my client, that my client finds satisfies a sense of justice for in that action.
Yeah, and like John said, we can't control what the prosecutors do. Their client is the state. They have no direct duty, responsibility, liability, anything like that to victims of crime. Even if your state has passed a crime victims' right law, you still don't have any, there's no way to enforce those rules. So with that being said, politically, having someone who knows their way around the courthouse, and who, is reminding the prosecutor that this client is engaged, they want justice, that they're an active client, that can, tend to, keep them engaged in a case they would otherwise lose interest in. Like John said, if we're able to get involved early, we can go to the criminal court dates with the client. We can make our presence felt. We can let them know in a totally ethical way that, we're interested in the outcome and that we want justice in the criminal matter as well. Compare that to another case that I have with a drunk driver. It happened out of state. We are dealing with an insurance claim here, but that client did not come to me for quite some time. And since it was an out-of-state DUI, we don't really have a presence down there. I wasn't asked to go to the court dates or anything like that. And he got a letter in the mail after several years of litigation that basically said, well, we understand that you have insurance back home, and we're just not going to pursue this case anymore. We dismissed it. And he was absolutely beside himself because he had been keeping in touch with the prosecutor. He'd given up hours of his time to complete all the stuff they needed on their end. And essentially what we think happened is it just got too difficult, or the prosecutor made a procedural mistake, and, that case was ultimately dismissed. Contrast that, though, in some cases, like John said, if the criminal process goes well, there can be a pro se finding that the person was impaired. And if you're involved with an impaired driver, liability is almost a certainty. That, is another part where a civil attorney can help you, because in the cases where the state loses interest or it's a difficult case for them to make, anybody who follows, like true crime may know this about the O.J. Simpson case. O.J. Simpson won his criminal trial, but he lost the civil trial.
Right.
So there have actually been DUI cases that have come through here where the state either dismissed or reduced the charges, knocked it down to maybe reckless driving or something like that. And we were able to dig through the evidence in the file. We were able to get the test results. We were actually able to show that the driver was impaired for the purposes of our civil case, even though the criminal case was unsuccessful. Yeah. So the only way we can do that is we get involved early. It's another important thing. And the other big difference that civil attorneys can make in these drunk and impaired driver cases is that these are cases where the injuries can be extreme, and in that case, there may not be enough car insurance on the car that hit you. Especially there are some insurance policies out there that do not cover DUI beyond minimum limits, even if they're larger insurance policies. So that can often leave, the victim holding the bag there. That's when we explore other angles that we've talked about in other videos, like underinsured motorist coverage. But DUI specifically is a chance to look for other parties who may be responsible.
Third parties with dram shop claims.
Dram shop claims are a big source of something. In that case we handled up in Indiana, we were successful in getting some dram shop compensation for our client above and beyond just the auto insurance. We were also successful in that case pursuing another third-party claim, what's called negligent entrustment, which is where someone allows you to use their vehicle even though they should know that you're not capable of using it responsibly.
Right.
Anyone who gives a vehicle to someone who they know has been drinking has committed negligent entrustment, period.
Right.
And so sometimes there are, especially when younger people are involved, there can be a very irresponsible person who's driving the car, but there can be, potentially a more wealthy or a better insured person who is the one that actually gave them that car and shouldn't have, that can be used to fully compensate you for your serious injuries and these kinds of wrecks.
Right. And that's where that quote unquote slam dunk case gets very complicated quickly, because you've got so many plates that are spinning up in the air, and some of them more tenuous than others. And it really takes a dedicated lawyer, but an experienced lawyer that knows what to look for, that's willing to dig through and find the information that's helpful for your case. Some of that it would be in discovery. On that other case, when the negligent entrustment, it really came down to the deposition of one of the employees gave us just a wealth of information about what had happened in this particular case. We would not have known that early on in the case. It's just how these things develop, and you really have to have somebody that's willing to pull the string and follow it wherever it leads. The other thing, another layer of complication. So oftentimes defendants have the ability to file for bankruptcy and bankrupt a claim. Now, for minor injuries, maybe not a big deal because you're able to get compensated through insurance. It doesn't affect that. But in DUI cases where you have severe injuries, impairment, and death, it may be very important that you have the ability to defeat bankruptcy. Because if a defendant's willing to file bankruptcy, you better have an attorney that knows what they're doing. In this case, our firm has handled this a couple times, different times, and we've done it with great success. But you're going to want to make sure that you enter an appearance in the bankruptcy and file an objection to any discharge, because the bankruptcy court may not be aware that it's an intentional tort,
it's your responsibility.
DUI. There's an exclusion for DUI within bankruptcy.
Right. So you can't receive a bankruptcy discharge if you hurt someone through the actions of drunk driving.
Right.
However, it's your responsibility as the victim to insert yourself into that bankruptcy proceeding and let them know that that's what happened, because the person who's filing for bankruptcy, the person who hit you, they have no responsibility to say that themselves. And so it's important that you are prepared to deal with that. We've had to deal with it, like John said, several times in these wrecks. People try to file bankruptcies because sometimes they are able to go through and they can avoid some of this stuff.
Well, they're wanting to avoid the consequences of their behavior, and then you're stuck holding the bag, both financially but also health-wise.
Sure, and ultimately, all of this, the criminal stuff that we've talked about, the civil stuff that we've talked about, is about getting, you fully compensated back on your feet for what happened, and, seeking a measure of justice against these people. And so, the more your attorney understands all of the ins and outs of how the various pieces of the puzzle work, the better represented you're going to be in this whole situation. As John said, these can become complicated cases. Further complicating factor is that when you have, separate lines of places you're trying to get compensation from, you have to make sure that you don't do anything to affect each one. There's some case law out in Kentucky. I believe there's similar case law in Indiana where you can actually, give up claims against certain defendants if you settle too early with other ones. There's not enough time to get into every scenario like that. It's a case-by-case basis thing, and that's why it's a good idea to have a good attorney on your side, somebody, who has experience handling these, particular cases, who goes to trial, those kind of things. That's the kind of civil attorney you want for a case like this. So with that being said, I think we're about ready to wrap it up.
Yeah, and if you got any questions regarding the DUI wreck, if you or anyone that was injured, feel free to reach out to, or if you have any questions regarding DUIs or that you want answered, leave them in the comments below. We'd like to do another video if it's good information we think would be helpful for the public. You can also look at our website. We have a blog that we talk about these various issues, and you kind of get more information there if you decide to. Hope you have a happy, safe New Year's Eve. Stein Whatley Attorneys, serious results.